So, hi, I'm Elisa Austin with the Grass Valley Library, and again, we are celebrating Lola Montez's 200th birthday. And we are here with Bruce Seymour, author of Lola Montez, A Life. Let me hold up his book, and What a Life.
Oh, yes.
Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you.
This is your doing. You put me in contact with all these speakers: James Morton, Reinhold Rao, Dr. Marita Krause, and Annie Lohr. Unfortunately, Annie is under the weather and will not be joining us. You also told me about the National Portrait Gallery of Australia. They said that they will be sending information about the Lola painting. So this project has grown. I have been getting many emails regarding Lola, so thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Anything for Lola.
Yes, so let's start from the beginning. You are a two-time Jeopardy champion.
Well, actually, I'm more than two times. I won 4 games initially, and then my claim to fame was in the summer of 1990. I won a tournament called Super Jeopardy, which had a $250,000 prize. And that combined with my previous winnings worked out to about $306,000, which at the time had me as the all-time highest money winner on Jeopardy.
Woohoo!
Things have changed in 25 years, so, or 30 years now.
Yeah, wow. And then your life changed.
I went off to Germany.
Right? You went
to
Germany.
Germany and was supposedly going to help on a business, and ended up finding my German friend was a better businessman than I was. And so I ended up reading a biography of Franz Liszt, which introduced me to the idea of Lola. And I went off to Dresden to see if the Liszt biography was accurate, and ended up spending about 3 or 4 years of my life with Lola.
What exactly made you go, oh, I need to find out more about this woman? What was it?
Possibly boredom. I mean, I had clearly become moderately useless to the business I was supposed to be helping run. And I was looking for something to do, and Dresden was fairly close, and Liszt and Lola were together in Dresden. So I thought that's the place to go. I subsequently realized that it was the wrong place to go, because all of Germany at that time was under press censorship. So that if anything happened in a particular one of the small German states that was in any way scandalous, it never appeared in the local papers. It appeared in the newspapers of the other German states from their correspondents who wrote back. And because the other German states were happy to have scandalous news about their neighbors, they would print it. But you don't go to read the local newspapers where you think something was going on. You have to read the neighbor's newspaper. That was something I learned in the course of my research.
And you traveled around the world. Where did you, for Lola, where did you go to research the book?
I went to almost every place Lola was. I spent a lot of time in Germany, but I was also in Ireland, in England, in Scotland, in France, mostly Paris, but a few other places, Belgium, Poland, Russia, Spain, of course, California, and most of the major cities in the United States she visited. In Australia, I was in Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide. And I was in India twice. And so was Lola. She was there twice.
Yeah.
So I hit almost every place Lola was, and found a lot of things.
Yeah. Now, we would not be celebrating this week if it were not for you. You went to Liverpool and found her baptismal certificate, right?
Well, actually, the truth of the matter is, I think you held up the hard hardcover copy of my book?
Yes.
Well, that's not the right one to read.
Oh.
Because that was the original publication. And in there, if you read it carefully, you will notice I'm a little uncertain as to when Lola was born. Well, after my book was published, a gentleman from Arundel, England, named Nicholas Shreve, got in touch with me and said, oh, I was writing my own book about Lola, and I've been doing research, but now that your book has been written, I guess I'm not going to write my book. But he said, I know where and when Lola was born. Do you? And I wrote back and I said, well, no, actually, I don't. And it turned out that Mr. Shreve, in doing his research, had found a record in the British National Archives. At that time, it was known as the Public Record Office, but they now call it the National Archives, where Lola's mother, after Lola's father had died, applied for a widow's pension. And to get a larger pension, she had included proof that Lola was the late officer's daughter. And among the proof was a transcript of her baptismal certificate, which she was baptized in Liverpool, which was a surprise because neither of us knew she'd ever been in Liverpool. She was baptized on February 16th, 1823, which I knew couldn't have been just after she'd been born, and I knew she wasn't born in Liverpool. But as Mr. Shreve found, on the back, Lola's mother, although I can't swear it was Lola's mother, but I think it must have been, had written, Elizabeth Rosanna Gilbert was born on February 17, 1821 in Grange, County Sligo, Ireland. And Mr. Shreve has all the credit for finding that. And unfortunately, Mr. Shreve is no longer with us, but I want to give him credit. And that's the reason not to read the hardbound version of my book, because when Yale published the paperback version, they allowed me to make corrections. And you will find that in the paperback version, I include the information about the fact that she was born on February 17, 1821 in Grange. So fortunately, the hardback is out of print. So only people who go to libraries can be further confused.
Now, she was the granddaughter of Charles Silver Oliver, Member of Parliament. And today, Castle Oliver can now be rented out for 10 to 15,000 euros. Maybe you can have a Lola conference there. And her father was stationed in Ireland, I guess, to deal with the revolting Irish. And Lola's parents were married in Cork, correct?
Yes, and the church is still there. It's now a public community center. It's no longer a church, but it's still there right in downtown Cork. And they have the parish record of the marriage of her parents there in 1820.
Okay. And then her father died in India not long after they got there. And you saw the grave, and it was her stepfather.
Well, the grave markers no longer exist.
Okay.
The records indicate that both Lola's father and her stepfather, by coincidence, are buried in the same cemetery outside Patna in India at the Dinapur base. There are still headstones there, but in an extensive search, I couldn't find either her father or her stepfather. But in the British Library, there's a book entitled Headstones of something along the line of Headstones of British Citizens Buried in India, which was written in the 19th century. And at that time, her father's headstone was still in the cemetery. And there's a transcript of it in the book that gives the date of his death and his age, which the headstone said he was 23, although headstones are notoriously unreliable. Yeah. It's possible he was more than 23.
Yeah, because I thought she
Lately,
was a lot older than uh, uh, Lola's mother.
Lola's mother was probably about 16,
Okay.
because when she died in 1870, it works out, if you take it back from the age that was given at her death, that she was born in 1804 or 1805.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now, there have been lots of photos online of Lola. I know you mentioned some that were not her. I was, I look at some of these pictures and I'm thinking, that's not Lola.
You're probably right.
Yes. So I'll hold up this one. I'll just kind of try not to.
That's definitely Lola.
That's
And
definitely Lola.
that's one of my favorites. I think
Yeah,
that's
she looks healthy. This is probably when she was in Grass Valley when she was working in the garden, I think.
no, that's from New York. It was
Oh,
taken in
okay.
New York City. That's
She looks,
fairly late in her life.
she looks actually healthy there.
Mhm.
This one, I think you said was not her.
That is unfortunately on the cover of the most recent biography of Lola by Dr. Krauss in Germany. And she and I have differed on this, but I think the evidence is fairly strong that it can't be Lola because the photographer who took the picture did not open his studio until 1859 in Paris. And Lola was not in Paris after 1858.
Okay.
The other thing is that in 1859, Lola was 38 years old. And the woman in that photograph, Dr. Krauss says it's been retouched, which is probably true. But that woman in the photograph does not look 38 years old to me. And the other picture you just showed me, the one taken in New York, is when she's about 38 years old. Do
Okay.
they look like the same woman?
No,
No.
no. Okay, here's another one. This one looks like the late 19th century.
It's too bad that Annie Lohr can't talk with you because Annie Lohr is probably the world expert on images of Lola. There was a late 19th century entertainer who took the name Lola Montez.
Oh, interesting.
That may be Lola Montez, but it's not our Lola Montez.
Here's another one, different nose.
Yeah, that's not Lola. I mean,
Yeah.
clearly.
Could be another Lola. Okay, here's another one here. This one looks like she has a double chin.
No, that I don't think is Lola, but it's such an ambiguous portrait. It's a painting and not a photograph.
Right.
And you could just say he decided to make her look bad.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I don't think it's Lola. If it's Lola, it's a terrible portrait.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one. That one?
No, that one is definitely not Lola, although it appears all over the internet and in various places. But anybody looking at the legitimate pictures of Lola and looking at that one says, that's not the same person.
Okay, here's another one.
Yeah, that one is in the Bancroft, and that's identified in the Bancroft library as being Lola Montez. And I've told them, no, it's not Lola Montez. Again, all you have to do is look at the legitimate photographs and say it's not the same woman,
Right.
but they haven't changed the identification.
And of course, the last one here is her in I think her later religious years.
Yeah, that's Lola. That's in New York. I can't remember the exact year right now, 1857, I think. Up to 1857, she had long finger curls. And you'll see the difference that she cuts off her curls in 1857 and starts wearing a rather short frizzy hairdo that was in the first photograph he showed. And she kept that for the rest of her life. So you can, photographs of her, you can easily divide between 1857, when she cut her curls off, and afterwards. You can divide the photographs that way. And the picture you just showed with the shawl, yeah, the one on my left-hand side of the screen is after she's cut her curls off. The one on the right-hand side of the screen is when she still had her curls.
Uh-huh.
And she cut off her curls about the time she started her lecture career. And I think she looks much better with the shorter hairdo, but maybe I don't have any taste for what women should look like in 1857. I don't know.
Now, Lola obviously had some temper. She seemed like she had mental health problems. Now, was it caused by neglect by her mother, do you think? Or I was just wondering what contributed to her instability.
Well, if you asked Lola, she would definitely blame her mother. She disliked her mother, and on numerous occasions stated that her mother was totally self-involved, and said that every bad characteristic Lola had was the responsibility of her mother, which is a nice way out of all of your problems. It's not my problem. It's my mother did it to me. I think Lola had her problems. She definitely had a temper. She was, of course, half Irish, so
right.
No big surprise. She definitely had a temper. I suspect she used her temper sometimes knowingly, that she realized that if she wanted to get her way, throwing a fit was a very effective way to get just what she wanted. So I think it may have been calculated at times. I think she wasn't that troubled. She was an extraordinarily strong personality. When you think about what she did, traveling most of the time by herself, she went to more countries than almost any woman of her age had visited. At least she was in 4 different continents.
Yes.
And most of the time she was traveling by herself, or certainly managing her own travels.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something extraordinary in her time.
Right.
So you had to be a strong person. You had to be a person with will and patience. And her life, particularly after the death of her friend Fallon, I think she began to feel that there was a void in the center of her life, that she was looking for more meaning. She got into spiritualism, then got deeply involved in Christianity and various kinds of Christianity. I don't think she was ever very orthodox in her Christian views.
Yeah.
But later, and I think, as I say in my biography, I sort of tried to sum it up, that I think she came to realize that the strength of character and the personal force that she had that had put her through so many things, in the process, she had trampled over a lot of people who did not deserve to be treated the way she treated them. And I think she regretted that at the end of her life. And I think there was a reason that she did not have Lola Montez on her headstone. Her headstone says Mrs. Eliza Gilbert, which was a name she never bore because that was her maiden name, preceded by Mrs.
Yeah.
But I believe she told Mrs. Buchanan, her friend who took care of her in her last days, that she did not want to be remembered as Lola Montez, that she wanted to be simply Eliza Gilbert.
Yeah.
And that was towards the end of her life. But I think basically, I don't think she was a terribly troubled person. I don't think she was particularly reflective until the end of her life. And I think it was just full speed ahead. And let's don't look back.
Yeah. Now, she seemed like a pathological liar. Was that just part of the celebrity of her?
It was partly because there were a lot of things she didn't want to admit. She insisted to the end of her life that her relationship with King Ludwig was the relationship of good friends or father to daughter. We know from her letters and the king's letters that, well, it was pretty platonic, but not completely platonic. And in the 19th century, you didn't want to admit that, and she didn't admit that.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of things she lied about. For one thing, her entire personage was a lie for a good part of her life, that she pretended she was Spanish.
Yeah.
Which was a little complicated because she didn't speak Spanish very well. And she always had an excuse. The reason was that they were driven out of Spain and that she grew up overseas and only learned Spanish at home, and yeah, all kinds of good reasons. But the thing that was surprising was that even when the truth would not have been unflattering, she usually made up a lie. Which I think it was perhaps a way that she controlled her environment, that she could make reality what she wanted it to be.
Yeah.
And I think she enjoyed that.
Yeah. Now, she traveled around the world. Some of the places it sounded like you weren't quite sure she actually went to those places or not. Is that right?
I've done some research since I wrote the book. I actually found, as far as Russia, which I was really dubious, I went to St. Petersburg and found absolutely no trace of her there in the newspapers. But I went back a second time, and one thing I discovered then was she writes in her memoirs, and you can put in the timeline exactly the time she could have been in St. Petersburg, because I could follow her in the newspapers all the way to Latvia. That after she got thrown out of Poland for inciting revolution in Poland, she went back across the Baltic, and I could follow her engagements at various theaters all the way to Latvia, and then she disappeared for about 2.5 months before there's a report that she's headed back towards Germany in the papers. And so I went and searched the Russian newspapers, and there was nothing at all. And I thought it was unlikely that Poland was under the control of Russia at this time, and she'd just been deported from Poland. And I found it amazing that she would then get into Russia itself. But first of all, I found that the time she was in St. Petersburg was just before Lent, when all the theaters closed. So she had gone there thinking she was going to get an engagement in one of the theaters, but the theaters were in the process of closing down when she got there. And then I discovered, after the book was written, a memoir of a German actor who was in the German theater in St. Petersburg at the time, recalling her visit. And he said that what happened was she in her hotel, she put on a little dance to convince people of her talent. And he said she managed to fall in the course of her audition. And then one of the officers from the court arrived at her hotel and announced that she was about to leave the country. And she said, well, I can't, I'd have to pack up my things. And he says, all your things will be waiting for you at the border. And she was escorted out of Russia. I think that's what really happened. I think she did get to Russia, but they figured out who she was and they deported her out of Russia too. She told a different story afterwards, but mostly she told the truth. She claimed she'd been to Istanbul. I'm sure she never got to Istanbul. On one of her trips, she gave a toast on board the ship that was taking her across the Atlantic, talking about how she'd been on every ocean. She had been on the Red Sea. She'd been on the White Sea. She hadn't been there. But in general, she went to a phenomenal number of places.
Yeah. And so, okay, so do we know the true spider dance of Lola? Has anyone discovered that?
No, and I don't think there was one spider dance. I think the spider dance she gave in her debut in 1843 in London, the dance she did between the acts of the Barber of Seville in London was billed as a tarantella, a spider dance. So she really started her career with the spider dance, but I think it evolved over time. And to a certain extent, it may have depended on the audience. And there were outraged articles, but often they were written by people who hadn't seen her performance.
Mhm.
And she may have encouraged it because it was great publicity.
Yeah.
But if you read the reviews by people who had attended the performance, almost always they said, you know, it's really harmless. It's just a sort of a silly pantomime.
Yeah.
And the articles, you have to remember, this was the 19th century when it was extremely erotic for a woman to show her ankle. Uh, and some of the reviews talk about, whoa, we saw quite a bit of calf. Well, you know, this was not a burlesque dance that she was doing. It was mostly probably a lot of skirt swirling, but nothing particularly outrageous, certainly by contemporary standards today. So, yeah, but there is nobody really knows. And there may, as I say, may have been various spider dances depending on what she felt like doing that evening.
Yeah, yeah, and I was reading, that, at various parties she had danced naked, and so who knows about that?
Yeah, I find that very unlikely because she was very liberal for her time, but she knew what could really get her cut out of society, and I don't think she ever went there.
Yeah, okay. Now, she took boats down to South America to get to either coast of the United States. And that was much more faster than going across the United States.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
and going across the United States was still a dangerous proposition. There was no railway. This was, we're talking 1850, what, 1853 or 4,
Yeah.
and there was no really reliable way to cross the country. And most of the 49ers who came to California, some of them came across the country, but you always had to go in a large convoy for protection. And it was
Oh, you're breaking up.
much faster to take the ship. And what she did the first time going west to California. There you are.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah, you're kind of breaking up a little.
Internet connection is unstable here.
Okay.
Okay, well, I hope we're back.
Yes.
Going to California, she crossed Panama.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there was no canal then. You went down to, and Panama was actually part of Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
Went down and then crossed with donkeys and in dugout canoes across the isthmus, and then came up from the coast of Panama. On the way back, she went down only to Nicaragua, and then went across Lake Nicaragua and down the river on the eastern side to the coast, and took a ship back to New York.
Yeah, and she took a paddle wheel boat down.
Yeah,
unusual.
Supposedly on the, I can't remember the name of the river that went from Lake Nicaragua down to the east coast of Nicaragua. But yeah, supposedly it was a small paddle wheel boat that I think was run by Commodore Vanderbilt.
Oh, interesting.
That he had that concession.
Okay, so, and then let's see, when she came to Grass Valley, she supposedly helped the economy of the Empire Mine. The house down the street from the library was actually painted white, and it was the only home she ever owned. She had gardens and various animals, and including her pet bear cub, which was not shot, but
no, it was not shot.
Yes.
It didn't have a very good fate, though, because subsequently in the newspapers, an article appeared that Lola's bear was going to be used for bear baiting at the 4th of July celebration. So it did not come to a happy end, I don't think.
No, and yeah, because like a lot of stories kept saying that Patrick Cole shot the bear. So
Yeah, well, Patrick Hull, we have a letter by Lola from September 12th or September 14th of 1850, would have been four, I think, 1854, saying that Mr. Hull left for San Francisco yesterday, and I trust he will never trouble me again. It was a brief romance.
yes, and let's see, Charles was it Charles Wart. Let me make sure I'm
Warwick.
Warnick said she had 2 pet bear cubs, and I wonder what happened to the other one. Maybe it just became too much for her.
Yeah, she may have lost her taste for bears after the bear tasted her.
Yeah, yeah.
The story is she got rid of her cub when it bit her hand when she was feeding it.
Yeah, not a good idea to have a pet bear. Yeah.
She was always liked animals, though. She almost always had a dog traveling with her.
Yeah, Gip. Her dog Gip.
Yeah, Gip and Flora, her poodle. In Munich, she had 2 dogs. She had Turk and I can't remember, the Turk and Zampa were her 2 dogs in Munich. So she had quite a collection.
And then Lola seemed a little more tame in Grass Valley compared to other parts of the world. Of course, there was the story of Henry Shipley, the editor of the Grass Valley Telegraph. And I marked the page where, let's see here. Hope I have it. So she was wanting to defend some artists, was that correct? Some theater people, and then the editor confronted her at her house where she was sick in bed, and the only point on which their accounts of the encounter agree is that Lola threatened Shipley with a revolver. She claims she drove him from her house at gunpoint after he threatened to cut her throat, though he declared that he retreated calmly in the face of unprovoked violence. So that seems like, I guess that was one of the biggest news stories for Grass Valley for Lola.
It was, yeah. And they later had an encounter down in a bar downtown, as I recall, was when she tried to horsewhip him.
Yeah.
But yeah, he had a fairly sad life. I don't know if I mentioned it in the book. He was a graduate of Amherst, actually.
Oh, wow.
A lot of people who came out for the gold rush were really well-educated people. His problem was he was an alcoholic, and he died very young, having drunk himself to death.
Wow. So, okay. And then, of course, Lotta Crabtree. Now, you think that the dance training was actually by the Robinsons and not really by Lola.
Yeah, I mentioned that in the book, that the Robinsons actually had a dance. It's hard to believe that in Grass Valley in 1854, there's a dance academy.
Yeah.
But there was. The Robinsons were running a dance school, and the Robinsons, and I think Lotta and Lola all lived on Mill Street.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an account in the newspaper of Lola throwing a Christmas party for all the children in Grass Valley. So it's very possible she met Lotta. There's the story of Lotta supposedly dancing on the anvil in Rough and Ready, and things like that. The trouble is, all of these stories about Lola and Lotta do not appear until years after Lola was dead. There are no contemporary accounts of Lola and Lotta having anything to do with each other. And my guess is that because they did coincide in time, that Lotta later in her career used that simply in her publicity. That's because Lola had become legendary. Lotta became legendary in her own way.
Yeah.
But I suspect it was Lotta's publicity agent who came up with the story that she'd learned her dancing from Lola. And the fact is that on the day, I think I mentioned this to you before, that the day Lola left California, sailing to Nicaragua, never to return, was the very day that Lotta made her San Francisco debut as a child prodigy.
Uh-huh.
So there was that connection, but I would have thought that since Lola was there when Lotta was coming down about to make her debut, that there would have been something in the papers about Lotta saying farewell to her mentor or something. There's no mention at all of any connection between Lola and Lotta until years later.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay, and then of course Josiah Royce's family lived here where the site where the library is today, but Josiah was only a baby when Lola was here. So there was, he had no connection to Lola. They were just here at the same time. So
I don't think either of them ever claimed it.
yeah. Okay, and let's see. And then you donated your research to the Bancroft Library, and it has the largest collection of Lola information. So I'm putting that out there for.
Yeah, by far, if anybody's interested in Lola, come to the Bancroft. They're like, I think it's 4, they call them bankers boxes that archivists, I think maybe it's 6 now. And the collection includes almost all the books that have ever been published about Lola, in addition to all my research notes. And for anyone who is also interested in Lola, most of my research notes, a good portion of them, are available on the internet, thanks to a gentleman who asked me if I would like to put my research materials on the internet. So if you go to zpub, zpub.com, if you search around there, you can find most of my research materials. A good portion of them are available online.
Yeah. Okay. And then you bought Lola a new tombstone in New York City.
I did, yeah. I felt that with the little money I made off my biography, I thought that I owed it to her, since she had kept me occupied for 3 or 4 years of my life, that I owed the little bit of money I got out of it. It was a losing prospect because I spent far more money in the research than I ever made for royalties. Right. But her original headstone was marble, and over 120 years, particularly with acid rain, it had become almost completely illegible. So there were old photographs of it, and I asked the cemetery gave me permission to replace it because there was no family descended from Lola to object to it. And I had them make the stone an exact copy as much as possible of the original on the front side, but instead of being made out of marble, it's made out of granite. The mason told me, I asked, how long will this one last? And he said, about as long as the pyramids. But on the back, I did something that Lola might not have approved of. On the back, I had them inscribe that she was born, that her known as Lola Montez, Countess of Lansfeld, born at Grange, County Sligo, Ireland on February 17, 1821. And as I said before, I don't think she wanted Lola Montez on her tombstone. Yeah. But I felt maybe she's mellowed a little in another world. And it is confusing because Mrs. Buchanan, who put up the original headstone, I don't think she knew how old Lola really was. They had been girlhood friends in Scotland. So she had a vague idea, although I discovered Mrs. Buchanan herself in the census lied about her own age. Because I found her birth certificate, her birth evidence back in Scotland. She was taking a few years off.
Yeah.
But she put on the front, Mrs. Eliza Gilbert died on January 17th, 1861, age 42. And in fact, her death date was exactly 1 month before her 40th birthday. So she was not 42. So there's a little cognitive dissonance between the two sides of the headstone. One side says she was 42 in 1861, and the other side says she was born in 1821. But I assume anyone who really cares will read my book and figure out what the truth is.
There you go. And Mrs. Buchanan, I guess she didn't quite know exactly the relationship with Lola and King Ludwig. So Mrs. Buchanan wrote to King Ludwig asking if he would pay for a fence to be around the around her grave.
Well, that was the second letter, and
Yes.
Both letters are in the Bavarian State Library in Munich. Mrs. Buchanan's letters to the king, they're both in his papers that he left to the library. And the first one is very touching because in it, and I think it's completely true and accurate, she says that on her deathbed, her childhood friend, known to her as Eliza Gilbert, had requested that she write to the king and say that she had died a true Christian and that she regretted the way that she had treated the king when
Yes.
we had known each other, and that she was always grateful for his goodness to her. Words to that effect. And the king wrote back. The king's reply is in Harvard, at the Harvard University Theatrical Collection, because apparently the Buchanan family sold what they had after Lola died to Harvard, so that the reading copies of Lola's lectures are in the Harvard Theatrical Collection, the ones that she actually used on the platform. You can tell from where the page is a little dirty, where she always grabbed it to turn the page when she lectured. So his letter is there, and he wrote back in English and said he was gratified to hear that she had died a good Christian, and said she was a remarkable woman, which was a nice way of not saying more than he could. But then Mrs. Buchanan wrote back and said, perhaps you would like to contribute to a fund her friends have put up to put a fence around her grave, which he did not answer, apparently.
Yeah. Right.
But I often have wondered, and I'll have to talk to Dr. Krauss, who has now seen Ludwig's diaries, that I would be interested to know if Ludwig wrote in his diary or said to himself, perhaps, the woman is dead and she's still after me for money.
Yeah, she was pretty greedy with King Ludwig. So.
She was, I have to say, when I read their correspondence, I almost gave up the idea of writing the biography because I thought she was so duplicitous and so treated Ludwig, who obviously was absolutely taken with her.
Yeah.
She treated him so vilely and lied to him at every possible opportunity.
Yeah.
And ultimately got to the point that she tried to blackmail him with his love letters to her.
Yeah.
And I think she really regretted that in later years. I think she became a different person beginning in Grass Valley. I think Grass Valley was the beginning of a turning point for her, where she slowed down and she stopped and realized that she had been running over people her entire life. Yeah. And that the only person who had really counted to her was Lola Montez. And I think that started to change. In the papers while she was in Grass Valley, and particularly after she died, remembering Lola, that the papers in California remarked that she was terribly kind, that she would do things, sit up with sick miners and sit by bedsides of sick children and console their mothers, things that were not what you would have expected out of Lola Montez. And I think Grass Valley was a turning point for her.
Yeah. So do you want to add anything else? I think we're starting to close it up here.
No, I probably talked about 3 times as much as you could possibly want to use here. But I'd say read the book. I think it's still the best biography of Lola Montez, but that's my modest personal opinion. If you're really interested, go to ZPub, look at some of the materials on ZPub, and if you're super interested, come to Berkeley and go to the Bancroft.
Okay, so thank you, Bruce, for talking about your book, and Lola, it has been an absolute delight having you speak with us today and celebrating Lola's 200th birthday.
200! Yes.
Okay, take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lola lives.
Yes, she does. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.